All right, good day, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation, The Artful Dodger Economy, How Much Longer, generously sponsored by Champion Fiberglass and Hilti. My name is Colleen Beatty, and I'm the senior editor here at Electrical Contractor Magazine. On behalf of the magazine, I want to thank all of you for attending today's presentation. So before we get started, I just want to go over some housekeeping items very quickly. So just to assure you, we will be recording today's presentation, and we'll be providing you with a link to that recording after the webinar is over. So if you miss anything or if you have to leave early, that's totally fine. You can come back anytime and watch the recording when it works for you. And of course, we encourage your participation in today's webinar. If you have any questions during the webinar at any time, you can send them in through the Q&A module. It should be on the right of your screen. And I will highlight it for you here. And we'll have time at the end of the webinar to answer them. You can also use the Q&A window to reach out if you have any technical issues. There's also a quick survey that should pop up on your screen at the end of the webinar, and we'll hope you'll fill that out. Or if you'd like to fill it out sooner, just click on the icon with the clipboard. I'm highlighting that for you at the bottom of your screen to open it up. It's just a couple of quick questions. So with all of that out of the way, I'd like to give a warm welcome to today's speaker, economist Dr. Kuehl, who is Managing Director of Armada Corporate Intelligence, and I'll let him introduce himself. Welcome, Chris.
Very good, thank you. So she asked if I wanted an intro from her, and I said no, because these intros always make it sound like I can't hold a job. So what can I say that would be relevant? One of my favorite quotes from John Kenneth Galbraith is that the only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable. So maybe that's the best introduction. My favorite definition of an economist is somebody who explains tomorrow why the predictions they made yesterday didn't come true today. We are eternally grateful for meteorologists because they make us look good. The last few months have been a solid illustration of this because almost every prediction we made was coming apart. I mean, it was like if you go back to looking at what we thought was going to happen in the third quarter of this year, oh, it's going to be bad. It's going to be 1% maybe. We could maybe even fall into recession. So what did we get? 4.9% growth. I mean, are you kidding? We only missed it by what, 5 points? What happened, and what was it that drove third quarter activity so hard? And are we going to continue to see some of that drive into fourth quarter? Will we see it into 2024? The electrical contractor is kind of in the middle of this no matter what happens, because you're just whipsawed by everything going on up to what you do and then past. I mean, it's almost like you have no control. So the construction sector is going to determine how successful you are. You're dealing with all the input costs, you're dealing with worker shortage, you're dealing with supply chain issues, you're dealing with how are consumers responding, how are businesses responding. So I'm going to go through a lot of what we think is going on right now, and just warning you that if I did this seminar in another month, it would probably be almost totally different. So starting off with something that we all know, but we just forget sometimes, but it has a lot of implications as far as our economic performance is concerned. We are the big dog globally by a long shot. No other country, no other collection of countries like the European Union come even close to us. I mean, we are the dominant economy. Every single state in the Union corresponds to a country when it comes to GDP. My own state of Kansas corresponds to Ukraine, which actually makes a lot more sense than you would think, because we know that part of the challenge in Ukraine is that Eastern Ukrainians don't like Western Ukrainians, and Western Ukrainians don't like Eastern Ukrainians. The same in Kansas. Eastern Kansans don't like Western Kansans. Western Kansans don't like Eastern Kansans. As a matter of fact, Western Kansas has tried to secede 5 times. Not that it succeeded, but you get the idea. You look at these breakdowns, California alone has the same GDP as the UK. That makes it one of the 6th or 7th largest economies in the world. So what that does to national data, if you have a bad year in California, it makes the whole country look bad because by itself, California is a country. What that translates into when you look at things like recession is that at any given time, there's part of the US that is experiencing recession. There's another part of the country that isn't. There are industries that are essentially recession proof. There are industries that feel the chill winds of recession before anybody else does. You get reactions that are highly varied just because of the variability of the United States. And it just is important, particularly for the electrical contractor, because it's a matter of where you are and what industry you're serving. You know, just as an example, which we'll get to in more detail later, 2 or 3 years ago, the deadest sector of construction was hospitality for the most obvious of reasons. We were in the middle of the COVID shakedown, and we had no travel, there was no tourism, most of the hotels were shut down. Today, that's one of the fastest growing sectors in construction because people are back to traveling and we're back to vacationing and we're back to spending money on all those things we spent money on prior to the pandemic. And suddenly it's catch-up time for the hospitality sector. So I'll kind of come back to this as we talk, because making general statements about the US and its growth and its GDP, it's useful to the point of understanding where the country is, but it's more useful to kind of take a step back and say, what's my region look like? You know, if I'm active primarily in the state of Texas, well, for God's sakes, it's the same GDP as Canada. So it's one of the largest North American players. Anyway, you get the gist. As we look at some of the other factors that are having an influence on economic performance, one of the things is population shift. We are seeing a lot of redistribution of where people live. The West Coast is losing population rapidly, and it's being driven out predominantly by the high cost of living. People are leaving high tax states, and they're leaving states where the cost of living is high to go to states that have lower taxes and lower cost of living. This has always been a motivator, but it's been more accelerated because of the ability to work remotely. So people that would normally sort of have no choice but to stay where they are, well, now they can move wherever they want, and they can still do their job because, well, they do it remotely. Tulsa, Oklahoma, for example, is still paying people if they move to Tulsa and keep their original job. And I was in contact with a company that was in the San Francisco Bay Area. Two of them picked up and moved to Tulsa. The guy said, look, if you all want a $10,000 bonus that doesn't come out of our budget, move with me to Tulsa. All the work we do is remote. All of our clients are international. Doesn't matter where we are. And the whole company picked up and moved because, hey, what you can buy in Oklahoma for the amount of money, because they were still paying California wages. I mean, it just, people have that flexibility. A lot of the development up and down the middle of the country has been driven by transportation shift. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. But again, you can see urban areas losing population, rural areas picking up population, and particularly the suburbs. I mean, look at Dallas alone. Dallas, the center, is losing population. Everything around Dallas is growing. So the macroeconomic outlook, what do we think is going to be going on, given the fact that we have been blowing this forecast every quarter for quarter after quarter? If you had looked at what we were considering was Q3's growth at least 6 or 7 months ago, you would have seen it at 1% or less. People were saying, oh, it's going to be a bad quarter. Oh, it's going to be a recession. And we got 4.9. We got 4.9 because we started to see a dramatic rebuilding of inventory. All the way up till the middle of this year, we were seeing an abundance of stock and warehouse. People had reacted to the supply chain crisis by buying as much as they could get their hands on, and suddenly warehousing was in, and suddenly people were stockpiling and inventories were building up. Well, that threw off the whole reorder cycle, because now people didn't need to reorder because they had so much of this built up inventory. That began to erode in the third quarter. So people started to go through that inventory, and the reorder cycle started up. So people started doing a lot of inventory build, which they normally would have done in second quarter, maybe even first. But it got pushed to third quarter. So suddenly we see this huge jump in third quarter numbers. So now the consensus view for fourth quarter is back to anemic growth, 1%. However, if you look at the GDP now, they're not predicting 1%. They're currently saying 2.1%, maybe. So which is it? Are we going to grow at 1%? Are we going to grow at 2.1? Are we going to grow at 3, 5, 27? We don't know. A lot of Q3 was inventory, but a lot of it was also consumers. Consumers were hitting the stores. We had a good Halloween. We have had a pretty decent November. It's not record-breaking, but what used to be Black Friday is now Black November, and the whole month was full of discounts. And now we're going into that critical period between Thanksgiving and Christmas, which has 2, maybe 3 distinct phases. Phase 1 is real slowdown. For the first couple of weeks of December, we don't see much because everybody who wanted to buy early got out there during the Thanksgiving break and took advantage of all the sales and all that jazz. So that's kind of done. Next, we go into the pattern where the American male saves Christmas, and we do it every year the same way. We do not believe that Christmas will be on the 25th. We're quite convinced that it will be sometime in March. We have plenty of time. Suddenly, it occurs to us that Christmas is in 2 days, and we have not bought anything for anybody. The National Retail Federation did a study a number of years ago and discovered that of the men who shop the last 2 days before Christmas, fully 50% of what they purchase is bought at a convenience store. So if you have been the proud recipient of a six-pack and a scratcher's ticket, you now know why. What we end up doing is sending legions of irritated women back into the stores after Christmas to exchange the junk we bought them for something they really want, and invariably they spend 2 to 3 times what we spent on the original gift. I'm not making this up. So at the end of the year, we have this surge of spending post-Christmas as people begin to get what they actually want. If we thought we were being clever and we bought our loved ones a gift card, because nothing says, I love you, honey, we've been married for 20 years, buy yourself something nice. She does, and spends 4 to 5 times the value of the gift card. So every year, clueless American males with no idea what to buy anybody save Christmas, and we'll probably see it again this year. The Fed is looking at what it wants to do with rates, and if you look at what the investors are saying, they're being very hopeful. They're talking aggressively about, well, any minute now they're going to start lowering rates because, we're going to have a recession in the first couple of quarters, and that will certainly trigger the Fed to do something. Well, yeah, they may think that, but that's not what the Fed's saying. The Fed looks at a number of different factors. One of them that's very important to them is the U6 unemployment rate. Now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics issues a report every month, and there are 6 different cuts of that data, U1 through U6. U3 is what we always see quoted in the press because it's the first of the cuts to come out, and it's the simplest. It is literally just the people who are on unemployment, who are getting unemployment benefits, who are in the system. But there's a category, U6, which includes 2 groups that U3 does not pick up. Number 1 are the so-called discouraged workers. These are the ones who are unemployed but are not in the system. They're not getting unemployment, it has run out for them, or they never applied in the first place. It also will pick up the involuntary part-time. These are the people who are working a part-time job when they would rather work a full-time job. The U6 numbers are as low as they have been in years. And what that tends to mean is that there is a lot of sort of room as far as unemployment is concerned. The Fed is going to raise rates when they feel that there is an inflationary threat. They're going to lower rates when they think that recession is imminent. And one of the ways that they determine that recession is imminent is that the unemployment rate goes up. But as long as the unemployment rate is low, which it is now, low, very low, the Fed's like, we have room. We really haven't affected the economy that much. Inflation's still a problem, and people are still getting jobs, so we've got room to continue to either keep rates where they are or maybe even raise them. So you've got a buffer for all intents and purposes for the Fed of 3.6 million jobs. So wishful thinking on the part of the investors that, oh, any minute now they're going to start lowering rates. Yeah, that's not what you're hearing from the Fed. And we'll talk a little bit about their dot plot in a minute. Here's where inflation sits, according to the Fed's favorite measure. They do not look at the consumer price index. The CPI gets released every month, but it's a little artificial. It's based on two assumptions. One, that there's an average family of four. Assumption number two is that we know what they are buying, because the way you figure CPI is you have this basket of goods that this average family of four buy. You add all that up, and then you add it all up for the next month, and that tells you what inflation is, if there is an average family of four, and if you got the basket right. And frequently, they don't. So the Fed looks at PCE, personal consumption expenditure, much, much more accurate because it is what we actually bought and what it actually cost. But because it is real data, it lags. You can see recent numbers are from September. We don't know October. We don't know November. We won't for another month or two. So it could be different by now. But the last record we had, the 6-month rate was 3.2. The 12-month rate was 3.8. Fed's target is still 2. So as long as the Fed is considered 2 to maybe 2.5 as the target, inflation is still too high. It may be a half a point high. If it's the 6-month rate, it may be a full point high. But the Fed is still seeing high inflation and is still going to be looking at that more closely than recession. Where is the inflation? And this is where it becomes important for the electrical contractor. A lot of that inflation is coming off of shelter. It's coming off of construction. It's housing. It's multifamily housing. It's a whole series of things having to do with shelter. Also seeing a certain amount of increase in inflation when it comes to food away from home, et cetera. But look at the bottom of that graph. Look where the real drop has become, at least as far as CPI is concerned. Natural gas, oil, gasoline. Those have all been big factors in dropping the inflation rate to where it is now. The problem with that is that these are very volatile, and we know that. I mean, we've been watching this for years. It doesn't take much to suddenly jack the price of oil up. We've seen it happen over and over and over again. There was an expectation that it would jump when the Hamas war started, but it didn't. I mean, the predictions the day that that began was that oil was going to get into the 90s, maybe into the hundreds. Goldman Sachs, which is the champion of panic, basically said, oh, it's going to hit $200 a barrel. Go for crying out loud. It did not hit 90, did not hit 100. It stayed in the 80s. So it has continued to be in the lower range of the 80s, whether you're talking Brent crude or West Texas Intermediate, either one. So that has been a big contributor to keeping inflation down. But we know from past experience, all it's going to take would be a reaction from OPEC, some kind of problem with a production platform someplace. We're fortunately past the hurricane season, so that's not going to be a factor. But all manner of things could suddenly drive oil up into the 90s or maybe higher. And suddenly that inflation factor becomes less dramatic, and we could start to see inflation numbers come back up again. So here's the famous Fed dot plot. This is produced when you look at what the Fed decision makers are saying publicly. These are their speeches, their comments, minutes from the Fed meetings. The majority are saying that somewhere in the range between 4.3 and 6.2 in the coming year. That is a huge range. So you've got some people who are saying, oh, it's going to drop, maybe half a point, maybe a full point. And then others are saying, oh, no, it's going to go up a point. and there's not a lot of consensus. Oftentimes, these plots are a lot closer together. Look what it was in 2023. I mean, it was tight. Now it's spread all over the place. And when you get into 2025, even more so. So there's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of conversation between the hawks in the Fed and the doves. And it all comes down to what the Open Market Committee decides. The Open Market Committee is made up of the Fed governors plus 4 of the regional Fed presidents. And these 4 have a lot to do with how the Fed plans, because they're closest to the ground. They're the ones that are out in the regions kind of watching all this stuff. One of the things that's been of concern to the construction sector is what's happening with banks. Bank credit is drying up. It's tightening. And the majority of what was holding up construction projects the last couple of years were supply chain and labor, and those are still factors. But today, the number one inhibitor on construction projects is funding. They're not getting the money that they need. Now, it's important to understand what the banks are doing right now. I speak a lot to bankers, and the bankers are like, look, we have to loan. That's our business. We don't make money if we don't loan. But what's changed is that what we used to do is look strictly at the company that was looking for money. And it was like, if you're well run and your books are right and everything's good, then you're commercially acceptable and we'll loan you money. Now what they're doing is they look at that, of course, but they're also now looking at the industry you're in. So they are spending a lot more attention on, okay, what kind of business are you doing? If you're involved with residential housing, yeah, we don't think there's a lot of future there, and we're not too thrilled about lending to you. If you're in non-residential, but you're focusing on office buildings, oh, no, that's a bad sector. If you're in warehouse development and logistics and break bulk and all, well, that's a different story. We were more interested in you now. If you're a manufacturer that is servicing, say, the automotive sector or the aerospace sector, well, we're pretty happy with that, so we're okay with that. If you're focusing on the ag sector, yeah, maybe not so much. So right now, the major difference is the bank's paying a lot more attention to where you do business. And no matter how well run your company, if you're servicing a sector that's expected to run into trouble, then the banks get nervous. So it's no big surprise, but it's just a little bit of a shift. Retail spending still stable. Talked about that a minute ago. We're still doing well. Halloween was a good start to the season. For the 5th straight year, adult costumes outsold children's. It is now an adult holiday. It's now a decorating holiday, and it's the harbinger of things to come. November was not too bad. Some of the big box stores had some mixed results, but online, still booming. We have begun to see some distress in the consumer. Credit card loans are now sliding into delinquency. Currently, the U.S. consumer collectively has $70 trillion in debt. $7 trillion of that is credit cards. So there's a lot of trepidation, particularly for the lower third of income earners. They're the ones who are now living paycheck to paycheck. They're using their MasterCard to pay their Visa. And that's a group that's in big trouble. You're beginning to see some of that distress floating up into the other 2/3. It isn't a crisis yet, but it's moving in that direction. And this is what this shows. You know, you've got delinquency rates are rising fastest for lower income, but all of them are beginning to see delinquency rates rising. And this is going to include the middle third, the upper third. So that credit-fueled consumer is beginning to fade because they're running out of room to do that kind of credit. The next question is, what do they stop spending money on? And this is kind of the conundrum, because consumers in this country don't react like other consumers around the world. If you're in Europe and you've got, you know, some issue with what the future looks like, et cetera, well, you have a tendency to get cautious and you start to kind of worry about what the future may bring. The U.S. attitude is, well, there's inflation. Therefore, things are going to get more expensive. Therefore, I had better buy now. Furthermore, I might lose my job later, and then I can't buy anything. So I better buy now while I still have a job, so that when I get fired, I'll have a big screen TV to watch. So when we face economic distress, we spend. It's kind of like, well, I want to be prepared. Things might go south, so I need to go to Costco and buy 700 cans of cream corn so that I'm ready. It's just totally, the Europeans look at us like we're nuts, and perhaps we are. Household spending expectations, they're down, but look at the 20-year trend line. That's that dotted orange line. We're still above it. If it wasn't for that spike that we saw after the lockdown was lifted, these numbers would be seen, current numbers, as very good. They'd be seen as, well, gee, this is as high as we've been since 2014. But in comparison to where we've been the last couple of years, it looks anemic. So it's important to kind of put in perspective what that spike did to our expectations. We're kind of going back to normal, but normal high. We're still seeing a lot of spending above that 20-year norm. If you look at corporate investment, same thing. That dotted line, we're way above it, and we're still growing. We're still going up year over year, not as fast as we were earlier, but a lot of what's been driving this has been technology, robotics, automation. Workforce has been a huge issue for 10 years, and it just blows my mind that nobody has really taken it seriously, even though we know that it's coming. By the end of this decade, by 2030, the entire boomer generation will have reached retirement age, all 76 million of us. Now, the fact is we've fudged it because boomers are notorious for not having lives, and we just keep working, which you can do into your 60s and 70s. But then you get into your 80s, and all of a sudden it's like, I think I want to enjoy my golden weeks. So we quit. And the system isn't ready for this. I'm sure by now you have heard a number of economists talking about how by 2030 there's going to be the recession to end all recessions, it'll be the depression, it'll be the end of the world. What they're basing that on is that exodus of workforce. Now, they're not really predicting. To be honest, economists cannot predict till next Tuesday, much less till 2030. But what they're doing is warning. They're saying, look, you have this off-the-cliff moment when 76 million people are potentially out of your workforce and you don't have replacements for them. Now, how this translates into capital spending is that companies are spending an incredible amount of money on technology, robotics, and automation to replace people because they can't find people. They can't find the people with the skills they need. I know that the electrical contractors have been dealing with this as number one issue for a decade. Where do you find people? Who's training them? And too often people who don't understand, well, train them yourself. How? The majority of these companies are small. And it's like, so you're going to go to your senior guy and say, I want you to train Skippy here. He's not altogether sure what a light switch does, but I'm sure you can turn him into an electrical contractor. And the senior guy goes, really? Are you going to give me a release time for this? Are you going to give me a raise for this? No? Well, I'll tell you what, buddy, the number one way that companies are hiring right now is poaching each other. And the guy across the street's been trying to poach me for months. He's not asking me to train Skippy. So I think I'll go to work for him. And all of a sudden, your workforce challenge got even worse. So the CapEx is largely being driven by technology, and to a certain extent, construction to accommodate the technology. The commercial real estate sector is looking for the wall of debt to really hit next year. $1.4 trillion worth of commercial real estate loans coming to maturity. They're going to have to be renegotiated, and they're going to be renegotiated with much higher interest rates. So you're going to have a real blow to the construction sector for at least 2 years. Kind of extends into 26, 27 before it begins to calm down going into the latter part of the decade. But the next couple of years is going to be really tough. And there's going to be a lot of projects that will just suddenly die because they can't renegotiate the debt, and it suddenly becomes untenable, and they can't deal with it. If it makes you feel any better, China is hitting this right now, and it's decking their economy. So they're going to be creamed before we are. So there you go. Small favors. Non-residential construction spending is still pretty strong. It is still kind of living off the projects of the last couple of years. The big question is whether it's going to be continuing into 24, because there's not a lot in the pipeline. When I talk to construction companies, they're like, we're doing good now because we still have the projects we're working on, but we don't have a lot coming up in the coming year unless they're connected to some of the stuff that's coming out of the government. The CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, stupidest name for a legislation ever, has nothing to do with inflation or reduction. It's all about infrastructure. And the infrastructure money is just now starting to hit the economy. So if you're in any sector that's involved with traditional infrastructure or in things that are kind of connected to electrification and climate change and alternative energy, all those sorts of things, there's lots of money now starting to hit the economy, and that will play a bigger role in the coming year. Being a increased spending when it comes to construction, but it's beginning to cool in some areas. And that's where it's important to recognize that regional matters. You've got parts of the country where the slowdown is palpable. You know, it's really slowing in California, but it's on fire still in Texas. You get parts of the country that never got a lot of attention, but now are. I mean, South Dakota is one of the fastest growing states in the country with one of the lowest unemployment rates. It's 1.1. You have to want not to work if you're living in South Dakota. So that's becoming a play as well. Construction job shortages growing again. Job openings have surged again up to 431,000. Not as high as the peak, which we got towards the end of 22, but you're definitely seeing a lot of demand. There's a demand for 400,000 construction workers that we are not filling. And that gets worse with every passing year because apparently the politicians don't understand this, but age is chronological. If you were 64 this year, by golly, you're going to be 65 next year. And frankly, these are the kind of jobs that people can't do into their 70s and 80s and beyond. I mean, in the great scheme of things, I can be doing this kind of nonsense until I'm in my 90s. There's not a lot of heavy lifting. I don't know that you want a construction worker, out there on the job at 88. And that's apparently kind of what we're hoping happens. If you look at where the investments are taking place, a whole lot of activity around the digital economy, which is highly relevant for electrical contractors. Some of the fastest growing sectors are data centers and things that are heavily oriented towards electrics. You're seeing a lot of emphasis on alternative energy, and that is right smack in the middle of your sweet spot. As I mentioned earlier, hotel lodging is only 12th on the list, fourth fastest growing construction segment. And it's just because we're reversing the pattern that we saw in 2022. Look what happened to offices. Went from number 1 to number 10 in less than a year. So that's shifting rapidly. We do a construction spending outlook from Armada. This is something we call the watch, and our record on this has been spectacular. If I'm not bragging, we're at about 96-97% accurate. One thing to take away from this and not beat this to death, the chart on the right, look at the growth that you've seen in construction spending for the last decade. It's almost exponential. It just keeps going and going and going. We're so far above the trend line now that even with a little bit of a decline, we're still growing. And the expectation is still growth going into 2024. It's shifting. It's not retail. It's not going into office buildings. It's going into warehousing. It's going into break bulk facilities. It's going into infrastructure. It's going into the hospitality sector. The medical sector has come back to life. And that's critical for electrical contractors because that is a very strong market for the electrical contractor. Medical went on a real downer during 2020, 2021, because everybody was shying away from hospitals and elective surgery. Well, they're back, and that's stimulating a lot of expansion. When you look at global manufacturing in general, we're kind of back into respectable territory, just barely. This is a survey that indicates that anything over 50 is growth, anything under 50 is contraction. We got out of contraction. We're now sitting at 50, barely. But if you look at what else is happening in our own part of the world, Mexico left contraction and is now in more comfortable territory as far as growth. 21 countries still dealing with contraction. So generally speaking, manufacturing is not in horrible shape. A lot of these countries are in the upper 40s, but they're not as robust as they were maybe 6 months ago. Nickel prices have not really moved despite the fact that inventory is way down, so the stock levels are very low. This normally would promote price increases, but it really hasn't. The spot prices have stayed pretty consistent. If you look at aluminum, same thing. The warehouse stocks are way down, but spot prices, with a few spot exceptions, have stayed relatively stable. Same thing with copper. Copper is weird. Copper has not been performing at all as predicted because, and you can see that, it looks like an EKG. And part of this is the political nonsense around Chile and Peru and Zambia and in a bunch of the places that produce copper, and the fact that the demand has been uneven to a certain extent. Lead has again started to see a huge increase in inventories. Prices should, therefore, start coming down dramatically. Not a huge motivator within the electrical contracting industry, but it's significant to watch if this will actually behave the way that commodity inventories generally do. When you get a buildup like this, then you're going to see prices come down. The country that is probably going to benefit from this the most, and this is neither here nor there as far as most people's business, but one of the leading lead producers in the world is Indonesia. And Indonesia is right in the middle of a really dramatic economic recovery, which we'll talk about in a minute. They're building a whole new capital, and that in itself is a driver for construction. Construction materials prices have not been easing as quickly. The producer price index has been showing some decline, but not as much as one would expect. The biggest risk from kind of a commodity point of view is simply that oil operational levels are very low. Generally, when you get this low, prices start to come back up because there's an expectation that the demand will overwhelm the availability of oil. So we keep waiting for this, but it hasn't happened because we're not seeing the demand, particularly coming out of China, that has been driving oil in past years. China has really slowed down, and I don't want to go into a lot of gory detail here, but just a few little odds and ends. China's export income has never been lower. They are way, way down in terms of export revenue. They have managed to alienate most of the markets in the world they rely on. Foreign direct investment in China is at the lowest level since 1996. They have survived for 30, 40 years on foreign direct investment from all over the world, everybody wanting access to the Chinese economy. You remember the stories. If I could just sell one thing to every Chinese person, I would make $1 billion. Well, guess what? The Chinese consumer is not a very aggressive consumer, and they have not been buying despite all the incentives to do so, and China is not attracting money anymore. That foreign direct investment's going all kinds of other places, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, incredibly a lot of it into Mexico, which we'll talk about in a minute. So going forward, the prediction is that prices are going to stay fairly normal as far as oil is concerned. We still consume around 20 million barrels a day. We are capable of getting up as close to 15 and 16 million barrels a day. We're currently at about 12.5, but we can go higher. Most of what we don't produce ourselves, we get from Canada or Mexico. So we don't have much dependence on, if any, on the Middle East, North Africa, any place else in the world. But because oil is priced internationally, that production decision coming out of OPEC matters to us as well. But the point is, we're going to see prices most likely staying in the 80s. There will be periods where it goes up, but around the country right now, we're seeing some of the lowest gasoline prices we've seen all year. So inventories are expected to stay at midpoint, particularly in areas like gas and petroleum byproducts, but the distillates are kind of at the bottom of that average, and that has an impact on particularly the plastics industry. So for some reason, this graph showed up twice, so I'm not going to talk about it again. So there you go. I talked earlier about Mexico, and it's important to recognize a couple things about Mexico that really changed the game. We now import more from Mexico than we do from China for the first time since 2003. What we used to get from Mexico was oil, gas, and food. Today, we are getting a lot of consumer goods out of Mexico. Mexico basically said, look, do you not think we're capable of making socks and t-shirts and Christmas decorations? We can make all that stuff just as much as China can, but we weren't the low-cost production platform. We were more expensive than China, and therefore people went to China. That is no longer the case. China has gotten progressively more expensive. Mexico has gotten progressively cheaper. And when you add in the transportation costs, all of a sudden China's not such a good deal. And companies are like, if I'm going to produce t-shirts for Walmart, wonder what would be easier, making them in Guangzhou and putting them on a container ship and getting them out of a Chinese port and finding a port in the U.S. that it can get to and then transport it to a distribution center, or driving it across the border in Mexico. I think driving it across the border in Mexico is cheaper. And as a result, you're seeing a lot of investment in Mexico. Where China's foreign direct investment is the lowest that it's been since '96, Mexico's foreign direct investment is the highest it has ever been. You are not only seeing American companies going in, you're seeing companies from South Korea, from Japan, including China. One of the things to remember about China, the government may be the Communist Party of China, may be trying to reestablish Mao Zedong. The business community is the business community, and they want to make money. And they are increasingly saying, China's hard to make money in now. Just one stupid story. I have a colleague up in Fremont, Nebraska, who's an economic developer. And one morning he comes down and there's a Chinese guy waiting in his lobby. Can I help you? Yes, I am moving to Nebraska. Okay, what do I have to do? Support Husker football? Why are you moving to Nebraska? I manufacture products for the agricultural sector. China has a new tax that will tax me at 100% over a certain amount. I do not wish to work myself to death in order to pay 100% of my money to the Chinese government. I'm leaving. I'm moving here. This is where my customers are, so I'm moving here. And so this guy's like, what do I have to do to help you? I'm bringing 100 of my employees. They need a place to live. And he goes, this is Fremont, Nebraska. We have like 3 empty apartments. So they ended up having to bring in mobile homes in order to house this guy's workforce because he just picked up everything and shifted to the United States. That's happening all over Mexico. It's happening in the U.S. And if you look at what's happening next year, one of these 2 women will become president of Mexico in 2024. This will be history making. This will be the first female president Mexico has ever had. The woman on the right is Claudia Sheinbaum, and she was former mayor of Mexico City. She's in the current ruling party, Morena Party. She has been kind of a supporter of AMLO, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, but she's more of a pragmatist, trained as a scientist, literally quite a bit more pro-American than AMLO, and is considered a technocrat and wants to continue Mexico's economic growth. She's ahead in the polls right now, but not by a lot. If she wins, she'll not only become the first female president of Mexico, but the first Jewish president of Mexico. The woman on the left is Xochitl Galvez, and she's a former business consultant. She represents the PAN party. The PAN party is the one that brought us Vicente Fox a few years ago, Felipe Calderon. The weakness of PAN is it has always been very popular in the north. It's a business party. It represents kind of industrial Mexico, but it never carried a lot of votes outside the north. This is changing with Xochitl Galvez because her father is an indigenous Mexican Indian. So the southern part of Mexico, which is where most of the indigenous population lives, sees her as one of them. So now all of a sudden, PAN has support in the south as well as the north, and the polls are quite close. So one or the other of these women win, and both of them are pragmatists. Both of them are more pro-American. And given where Mexico's growth, Mexico is expected to grow at 3.5% next year, and it is stunning. I mean, if any of you have done work anywhere around, I mean, Monterey is building a skyscraper now that will be taller than the Empire State Building, and it's already rented out. I mean, so you're seeing a lot of expansion in those industrial areas because not only are U.S. companies investing, the second biggest investor in Mexico is South Korea, and they're putting up operations all over the country. So one last sort of thing to talk about as far as game changer, and then I really will shut up in case there are questions, and it has to do with Taiwan. One of the things we've been worried about and has been top of mind for people ever since the Ukraine situation began is what will China do with Taiwan? They threaten every year to invade. This has been going on since the end of the Second World War. You know, China claims Taiwan, Taiwan claims China. So are they going to invade? And one of the considerations was that if Taiwan was invaded, what would the U.S. do? Because we have a treaty with them, and Taiwan would not be able to defend itself without U.S. help. So the question was always, how far would we go? If China actually did invade Taiwan, would we become involved? China could not, or Taiwan could not defend itself alone. They can now. They have built the Qingtian missile. This is entirely from Taiwan. All the parts, everything is from Taiwan. This is entirely theirs. They do not rely on the U.S. or anybody else for any part of that missile. They are reputed to have over 100 of them and are building them as fast as they can. That missile has a range that allows them to attack literally all of China. I mean, from Beijing to Shanghai to Guangzhou, you name it, it's within range. So what you now have is the emergence of a new MAD strategy, mutual assured destruction. The Taiwanese are saying, you can invade us. We can't stop you. You're big. You've got lots of soldiers, lots of ships. If you do, we launch these missiles, and we essentially destroy half your population. Your call. If you think that you can survive this exchange, I know we'll lose. We're Taiwan. You'll take us. At what cost? And suddenly you're getting a whole lot of conversation within the Chinese military about, well, maybe we need to, if you've been watching, and I'm sure you all have, China has been purging its military ranks. The defense minister was purged. The leader of their missile division was purged. Dozens of generals have lost their jobs in the last 6 months, and they've been replaced by kind of more pragmatic leaders who are saying things like, well, maybe we don't really need to do an invasion. Maybe we can put economic pressure on Taiwan. Maybe we can try blockades. We can do all kinds of stuff. But even if they do a blockade, now you get to discuss Japan. Japan declared for the first time since the end of the Second World War that territory outside Japan was considered part of their national defense. They have declared Taiwan an integral part of Japanese defense, which means that if Taiwan is under attack, Japan considers it an attack on them. And the Japanese military has been dropping interesting little hints saying if there is a need, let's not forget that we have a rather large submarine navy. And the implication is that if you try to blockade Taiwan, that's trying to blockade us as far as we're concerned, and we can then attack you. And then China is like, okay, we're not picking a fight with the US now, we're picking a fight with Japan now. What does that mean? And it changes the environment completely. So this is something that's just starting to be digested. And, what does it mean for Asian activity? What does it mean for Chinese economic growth, et cetera? So it's an interesting conversation. We haven't heard a lot about it in the media, depending on which media you like to read. So with that, I think I've reached the end of my slides. And as a result, we're now going to open up for questions because I undoubtedly managed to talk about everything except what you're interested in. So here we go.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, please go ahead and ask your questions. You can put them in the Q&A module. I'm going to highlight it for you again. It should be on the right side of your screen under Chris's bio. So we do have a couple of questions that came in during the presentation. So let me pull those up. Will people moving to the suburbs create more residential building or commercial/institutional to serve that population shift?
Yeah, it should. That's been happening pretty routinely since then. What the major, I guess, difference between this migration and ones that we've seen in the past is a lot more interest in multifamily than single family. So because of the interest rates, the mortgage rates, and the average price of a home, et cetera, a lot of the people that are moving into the suburbs would probably be best described as first-time homeowners, or at least people who are in the kind of the bottom half of income earners. So they're not as interested in a single family as they are multifamily. So multifamily expansion has been up 25%, single family has been down 20%. And then you'll get all the institutional growth because, whether it's retail or public services, they sort of count population and rooftops. So if they see a lot of that multifamily coming into their area, well, then they have to react to it. And one of the things we're also seeing with multifamily is a lot more multi-use. So there may be lofts on top and retail and food and that kind of stuff underneath, almost a semi-European model. I've seen it in a lot of cities now where you're sort of getting these suburban neighborhoods that are almost self-contained, and everything from schools to churches to retail to medical, all sort of concentrated around those multifamily units.
All right. We have a couple questions about recession predictions. Are we still going to have a serious recession? Since we missed a few predicted recessions, is there an element of a self-fulfilling prophecy that might happen?
Yeah, there's not a lot of consensus on recession, except that almost nobody now is claiming that there's going to be a serious one. The consensus view of sort of the more depressing economists, and it's about half and half, is that there's going to be a shallow recession the first couple quarters, maybe down a point and a half. But a good 50% of those economists polled say, nope, we're not going to even have a shallow recession. We're going to have slow growth throughout first and second quarter, probably no more than 2%. But then by third quarter, it's going to be jumping back up closer to 3, maybe 3.5 for the year. So the interesting thing is that whether you're a glass half full or a glass half empty, there's consensus that at the end of the year, we're growing at about 2.53%. So we either start really slow with a shallow recession or just sort of slow, and then we end up speeding up towards the end of the year. I'm of the opinion that we're going to miss recession, at least nationally. There will certainly be parts of the country that feel it. I think California is probably headed for a recessionary period. Texas, on the other hand, is just giggling all the way to the bank and saying, we don't even allow that word here in Texas anymore. And that's probably a good indicator of the division within the country.
Mm. Well, that's definitely reassuring. Somebody's asking about, can you speak to graphene? You spoke about a couple of other commodities, and I think they were interested in the predictions for graphene.
Yeah, graphene has been behaving a little bit unusually too, because the inventories are down, but the pricing hasn't really reflected that yet. So there's a lot of conjecture. When I was looking through kind of the data, a lot of the analysts were like, this is weird. Generally, when you see the deterioration of inventory, well, that's kind of a trigger to see the prices go up, but we're not sure about demand. So the prices are not yet responding. So I think everyone is sort of waiting for one of two things. Either the demand will suddenly spike enough that it will justify some price increasing, or you'll see some kind of reaction to the inventory hold, and people will stop kind of holding supplies. Right now, everyone's attitude towards inventory is still skewed. Everyone was kind of taken by surprise by the supply chain and ended up doing uncharacteristic things when it came to inventory build. Now they're kind of getting back to normal, and that's starting to hit the metal markets and graphene and PVC and a whole lot of different commodities where the producers are like, well, we have no idea what's happening. So we don't know whether to produce more, produce less. And then the geopolitics get into it, because some of these commodities we get still from China. A lot of those rare earths are still predominantly coming out of China, and we are slowly replacing China. But the grim reality is that even though we have our own rare earths, it's environmentally destructive to get at it. The Chinese don't mind strip mining half their country. We're not sure we can talk Montana into becoming one giant pit. So we'll see.
Do you see a decrease in government spending coming, such as, or particularly with the DoD?
I think the government spending, it's going to be kind of odd, because we won't be seeing a lot of new spending coming in, because it's an election year and people tend to be a little bit preoccupied with campaigns. But all of that money that was allocated a couple of years ago is now starting to spill into the economy. So it's not new spending, it's money that was allocated, but it had to go through. Every time you get one of these infrastructure bills, you have to get the states engaged, you have to get communities engaged, you have to do environmental statements, there's all kinds of things. Those have now been completed, and the states have done what they need to do for that money to start moving. And so that is going to come cascading into the economy going, it's already started, but it's really going to accelerate into next year. In terms of additional money, probably not a lot being allocated in the coming year, mostly because of politics. The Defense Department is still expected to spend pretty heavily. We're questioning what we do with Ukraine, and so we're spending a little less money on that than we were, but now we're spending more money when it comes to Israel and trying to become more engaged with what's happening in that war. And then we always have the 27 other little wars that we seem to get our fingers involved in. So the Defense Department is expected to be pretty much in the same range that they have been, $700 to $800 billion.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. So you spoke a little bit about the rates. Do you think that they're going to come down in 2024 or go up, or?
The consensus view now, to the extent that there is one, is that the rates are probably going to stay where they are through at least the first half of the year. The investment community keeps saying, oh, any minute now they're going to lower the rates, but you're just not seeing it when it comes to the decision makers, and you're not seeing it with any of the other central banks, European Central Bank, Bank of England. Bank of England, Bank of Canada have both been sending out warnings saying, hey, we haven't defeated inflation. And if oil goes into a spiral, then we definitely have not dealt with inflation. So they're warning that their rates are going to stay higher. So I think the mantra that we've heard for the last 6 months, higher for longer, is going to continue for at least the first half of next year. Most of the analysts are kind of reading the tea leaves and saying it looks like the Fed is thinking third quarter of 24, maybe fourth quarter, where they would start to lower rates very incrementally, like a quarter of a point or a half a point at a time.
Okay. And actually, I have one more great question that I'd like to close out this webinar with.
Sure.
So do you have any advice for smaller contractors, what they should do in the coming year?
Yeah, I think right now it's a matter of being selective and cautious. I mean, as I started off, you're looking at a country that it's simultaneously can be down and up at the same time. So it kind of becomes a matter of staying alert to where the opportunities are. If you've got some regional flexibility, it's paying attention to what's happening in places like Texas. If it is a industry sector, it's like, well, don't be dependent on things like retail or single family housing, but if you've got connections into the hospital, healthcare sector, data centers, things that are still booming, that's where the emphasis should be. And for the contractor, it's just, that's kind of their way of life, is constantly trying to figure out where the growth is, because they're dependent on what other companies are thinking. And given the amount of activity that's taking place around Mexico, that's taking place around kind of the changing supply chain situation, there are some great opportunities there. I mean, even just shifting the transportation sector from the West Coast to the middle of the country, because you had the merger of two railroads that have now created this north, south, east, west railroad that connects Mexico firmly to the United States and Canada. And that's causing all kinds of development up and down the I-35 corridor.
All right. Well, with that, I think we should close out. So on behalf of Electrical Contractor Magazine and our sponsors, Champion Fiberglass and Hilti, I want to thank everyone once again for attending. A big thank you to Chris for such a fantastic presentation, chock full of some very important information. Please don't forget to fill out the survey, which should pop up on your screen when this webinar ends. Just a few quick questions. We just want to know how we did today. Also, be on the lookout for in your email for the recording of this event, which will be available soon. And also, if you enjoyed this webinar, please consider subscribing to Electrical Contractor Magazine if you haven't already. There should be a box on your screen to let you subscribe, but you can always just go to www.ecmag.com/subscription. Our 2024 Construction Outlook will be covering a lot of this information and more. So we hope that you will subscribe if you haven't already. So I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you at a future webinar.
Thanks very much.